Hi folks, welcome back. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the four forces of natural selection. A couple of these we have touched on. Certainly mutation we've touched on. We actually touched on gene flow a little bit too, but we'll talk about these a little bit more in detail today. We've been talking about natural selection ever since we started talking about Darwin. He did sort of show us how the mechanisms of natural selection, but in Darwin's time, natural selection was much more of a simplistic idea. Obviously, the more we get to know about it, just like any branch of science, the more we start to understand and the more we realize how nuanced it is. So, natural selection as we know it today has four major forces, meaning four things that actually cause it to happen, cause this over time change in the population or overall change in the frequency of a given allele in a population, which now that we've gone through Punnett squares and all that, you kind of understand what that means. Today we're going to concentrate on the four that are here in front of you. Mutation is the first one, so let's get into that. Mutation is the only source of new alleles. What does that mean? That means basically if somebody showed up with purple eyes, we're used to seeing blue and green and brown, but purple, that's brand new. And the only place something brand new in a population, ours, can come from is a new mutation. Now keep in mind, every baby that is born is mutated in its own way. That's why we all look the way we look. It's why you don't look like the spitting image of your parents. It's why you don't look exactly like all of your siblings. It's because we're each our own mutated version of what we are. 90% of those mutations, in fact, probably 99.9% of those mutations, are completely harmless. They don't do anything for you. They don't do anything against you. They're neutral. Mutation is the only source of new genetics, new genetic details, a new allele. Hopefully that makes sense. This can be put into different types, although I don't really subscribe to these, and you'll see why in just a second. Spontaneous mutations are theoretically those which have no known cause or no force that made them happen. Okay, but something happens, so they happen. So that's kind of a tenuous thing to begin with. There are induced mutations, which are caused by environmental agents, which we call mutagens. A mutagen is something that will cause a mutation. We know a lot of these. For example, smoking is a mutagen that can cause lung cancer, which is a mutation of your lung cells, right? The sun, the ultraviolet ray, can cause mutation, which we now know as skin cancer. You can have mutations caused by all sorts of things. For example, if you see a pregnant woman leaning up against the turned on microwave at a 7-Eleven or something, you might get a little nervous and be like, hey lady, you might want to keep your baby, your embryo, a little further away from that thing. Most mutations, as I mentioned before, are harmless. But some do change things. And sometimes the change that they are related to, or the benefit or negative, may come up later. In other words, the mutation may be around for years as a completely arbitrary thing. It doesn't do a good thing or a bad thing. But then something can happen where it helps or hurts. Or something can be really harmful for an individual in the beginning. And then over time, something changes in the environment that now it becomes a benefit. We'll see how these things work, and I'll give you a few examples. But keep in mind, almost all mutations are completely harmless. What kind of animal is that? It's a cheetah, you say? That's impossible. This cheetah has stripes down his back, not dots. What's going on? Can't be a cheetah. Cheetahs have spots. Well, of course, it is a cheetah. Those stripes on this cheetah are a mutation. This is relatively rare amongst cheetahs. Does it hurt the cheetah in any way? No. Cheetahs can run almost 70 miles per hour for very brief periods of time, and they catch game like that. They do sneak up to get close, but that's about it. Mostly they're dealing with scent blocking, staying downwind, things like that. They're not going to be really harmed if they have stripes instead of dots right now. So right now, this is a neutral or a meaningless or an arbitrary mutation. It doesn't hurt this animal at all. It doesn't really help them either. It's just sort of neutral. It doesn't do anything. What's this? It's an alligator. You can tell because you can't see any of his teeth sticking out. So it's a gator, not a croc. Okay, here's the alligator. What's wrong with it? This alligator has albinism. Here's the thing about alligators. Gators and crocs, for that matter, use their camouflage, have to blend into the swamp where they live better because it serves them in two ways. Number one, baby gators. They're tiny. They're only about 4 inches long, including their tail. So they're literally the bottom of the food chain when they're born. When they hatch, they come out bottom of the food chain. Frogs eat alligators. Birds, ironically, eat alligators. It's ironic because alligators switch and start eating frogs and birds and everything else in the swamp as they get larger and larger and larger. And they grow fairly quickly, but not quick enough. Do you think an albino alligator is going to blend in to the swamp very well? No. And what's more, as it becomes an adult gators, if you've ever gone down to a swamp anywhere here in the United States, pretty interesting, you may look around for gators and not see any. And then after a while, you're like, oh, wait a minute, that's not a log. That's not a log. Oh my God, there's gators everywhere. That's valid. The reason you don't see them at first until you start to get kind of more accustomed to what you're looking at is because they continue using that camouflage for their entire lives. At first, they use it to survive, and later they use it to hunt. So is this albino gator, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Sounds like a deleterious or negative or bad mutation, doesn't it? And indeed, it used to be. But if you've ever been to Louisiana or parts of Florida or Mississippi or anywhere in that area where you go to the swamps and you go to a gator farm to go see some gators, I guarantee you they have at least one albino gator at every single gator farm on the planet. So now in the gator farm, this is a sought after commodity because again, it brings in tourist dollars, number one. Number two, after that gator has lived a good long life being fed by the swamp boat tour guide every day, this gator is going to live high. It's going to live good. But then, after that gator dies, it's worth a lot more than an ordinary gator because of that pelt, because of that color, because of its skin. They're going to strip that gator and sell that albino gator skin to somebody who wants boots or a car seat or whatever the hell for a lot more money than what they would sell regular gator skin for. So this gator is valuable, therefore it is sought out as a baby, brought to the farm, protected, and fed very well for its entire life. So what we've done, remember back when we were talking about Thomas Hunt Morgan, when it's in a different environment, even something that seems deleterious can actually be very, very helpful. So we flipped the script because we changed the environment. There are a lot of stories of this happening. Most often we see it very quickly from human intervention. I think probably the most famous story is the peppered moth story. The peppered moth of England, they came in two colors really. They came in a bright whitish color and a peppered black and gray color. And after the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century in England, in fact, all of Europe, everything started to become sooty. And all of a sudden, the peppered moth, the darker colored moth, was the one that survived because its predators couldn't see it as easily as the stark white ones. So before it was kind of in between, but now after the Industrial Revolution, it became the peppered moth was a much more successful moth because the environment changed and happened to favor one or the other of those alleles. Does that make sense? Where else do we see this happening? It happens in humans too. Here we've got red blood cells. Do you see them? The one up top here, this kind of lozenge-shaped red blood cell, that's a good, normal, healthy red blood cell. What's it do? Well, the blood cell's job is literally to carry oxygen and nutrients throughout the body. It brings it to those tissues that need it. Now, below it, you see this odd-shaped blood cell. Most of you are probably already aware of what we're looking at. This is a condition called sickle cell, which is associated with certain areas of the world, and there's a really, really good reason for it. Now, most of you have probably heard of sickle cell anemia that can affect various people around the world. Anemia does not sound good, and indeed it's not. It means the tissues aren't getting enough nutrients and oxygen, which can, over time, without help, without intervention, can kill you. Sounds horrible, sounds painful, and it is. But, if you have just a few of these sickled cells, it can actually help in certain environments. Let's look to see where we find this trait around the world. Sickle cell anemia is very common throughout Central Africa, which is in red here. You can see all around the Arabian Peninsula, around the edges of the Arabian Peninsula, which is the wetter areas. And in fact, if this was a worldwide map, which for whatever reason it's not, this same red swath would go through the center of India, all of Southeast Asia, Central America. That whole equatorial band around the Earth is where we find populations that tend to have sickled cells. What else is very common in those areas? Malaria. What is malaria? Well, if you listen to the name, it sounds like bad air, mal-aria, which is indeed where it gets its name, because originally they thought it came from swamp gases. We now know malaria, which is a disease, is actually a parasite that lives half of its lifespan in the belly of a mosquito, which we find in swampy, wet, hot, humid areas. Now, as the mosquito that's infected with this malarial parasite bites you, it regurgitates that parasite into your bloodstream. And what does that parasite do? It wants to live off from your blood cells. It cannot get enough nutrients from sickled blood cells. So what happens is that parasite essentially, which you can think of like an invading army, they can't get a toehold in your body if some of your cells are sickled. Now, how does this work? Oh no. A Punnett square? What? Thought we were done with these. Well, we are, except remember, it's important that you understand the concept. So this is a little bit different than what we saw before. Here we have a codominant pair, and parent 1, capital A here, represents normal blood system, a normal blood. The capital S is sickled cells, okay? So most people in these areas are carriers, and we're going to explain why that is, why you see genetics like this. And this flows through to a lot of different things. Okay, let's talk about mom and dad. They're both carriers for the sickling trait. Do you see this? They both have an S. A-S-A-S. Mom, dad. Everybody on board so far? So now we have dad gets together with mom, and they both pass their normal blood gene to this offspring. Kid's going to be fine, right? Wrong. Because what's going to happen to this child? He's going to catch malaria in these areas where malaria is always present. By the way, malaria is an incredibly deadly disease. More people, more humans, have died of malaria than any other single cause in the history of humankind. Any other single cause in the history of humankind. More people have died from this one disease. It's so prevalent. Okay, so unfortunately, kid number one gets the regular blood cell genetics from dad, regular blood cell genetics from mom, and dies of malaria. This second kid gets the sickling feature from dad, the regular feature from mom, and hey, this kid has a natural propensity to not get infected from malaria. So living in a malarial place, this person's doing fine. They've got enough normal blood cells to have a healthy, normal life. They never even know they're a carrier. But they've got that sickling gene in there, so a few of them are sickled. They'll never get anemia, but they certainly won't get malaria either. Hey, that's a good thing. Look at what happens to the third kid. We get normal blood cell from dad, sickled cells from mom, another one, just like this kid, who's going to live a long, healthy, non-malarial, non-sickled cell life. Then this fourth kid gets the sickling gene from dad, sickling gene from mom. Uh-oh. Now this child has sickle cell anemia, and without treatment or modern medicine, they would die of sickle cell anemia. So in a normal, non-malarial environment, all three of these kids would survive just fine. In a malarial environment, this kid's going to die, and this kid's going to die of sickle cell. But these two are going to survive, which is better than everybody dying if they were all normal. Makes sense? So in fact, in the areas where malaria is always present, it's actually a beneficial trait to have some of your blood cells sickled, but not all of them. If too many of them are sickled, then you can have an issue with the disease. So again, we're talking percentages and we're talking survivorship. Gene flow. Now, gene flow and genetic drift, which are the next one, try not to get confused. Gene flow sounds like flowing of water and genetics, and genetic drift sounds like flowing of water and genetics. But there are very important distinctions between them. Gene flow, we've actually touched on to a lesser extent when we were talking about Haldane's rule and hybridization. Gene flow is the opposite of reproductive isolation. Gene flow is the transmission of genetics between populations. So when we start doing this, when we start getting on sailboats and sailing around the world and meeting other populations and making babies with them, we have just ceased the reproductive isolation between those two cultures that existed prior to that. And as I mentioned before, humans haven't been around long enough to make it make a difference. So they have happy, healthy, young babies who can go on and make more babies. So the thing to remember with gene flow is it's the opposite of reproductive isolation. It is the flow of genetics between two priorly isolated populations. There's a really stupid graphic I can show you, and I'll tell you right now, there's a really dumb way to remember this. And I'm going to show you. Okay, here we have two populations. This population are all brunettes. This population all blonde. Everybody see that? Make sense? Okay. Here's gene flow in a nutshell. You ready? First of all, we got this guy here. What's his name? Oh no. It's it's not Gene. Oh, his name is Gene. Uh-oh. And what's her name? Oh God, no. Her name's Flo. Oh, it's so cheesy. It's so cheesy. But hang on, hang on. Gene meets Flo. What's happening? They're transmitting. When they get together, what's happened to these two previously isolated populations? They've become one single population because Gene and Flo decided to get together. That is gene flow. It's a stupid way to remember it, I'm telling you, but you can't forget it now. When you're sitting there at the test, you're going to see gene flow, and you're immediately going to start thinking of like Gene Wilder and Gene Simmons and all the other genes, you know, and you're going to think, oh man, I'll never forget that now. Gene flow. Which brings us to genetic drift. Now with genetic drift, I want you to concentrate on the drift word here. Genetic drift means there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's purely random. What happens with genetic drift is genetic change due to chance, pure chance. The genetics that get wiped out in something like this have nothing to do with their adaptive or maladaptive aptitude, whether they're good or bad genetics for that population. In fact, they could be really good, but they just happen to get wiped out. The best way to describe to show this is again through another picture. This is genetic drift, random. Always remember those things. Okay. Let's start over here on the left-hand side. You're going to see two populations. I've got pond A and pond B. Everybody see that? Which one's bigger? Pond B is much larger, and that's going to play a big part in this genetic drift. Pond A, let's start with this. Here we have a pond that's got, what, 5 yellowfish and 1 redfish. Everybody see that? Let's say a bear comes walking along beside pond A, just feels like a snack, reaches in and snatches out one of the fish. If it happens to grab the red fish out of all of them, if it just happens to grab the red one, what has that bear just done to the population in pond A? To the redfish population? Completely wiped out. There are no more red fish in pond A. Does that make sense? Now, let's go over to pond B. Let's say different bear, different pond. Another bear reaches in, happens to grab a red fish out of pond B, which is a much larger population. Here they've got 16 yellowfish and 8 redfish. If it happens to grab a red fish, has it wiped out the redfish population? No. Furthermore, that redfish population had nothing to do with whether red or yellow is a better adaptation. It may be a worse adaptation, but it's neutral. It doesn't do anything for or against the fish. They're surviving just fine. So this is the other part of genetic drift. It acts more strongly on a smaller population. Does that make sense? It acts more on a smaller population and less on a larger population. It's kind of inverse. Does that make sense? You are affecting the genetics in pond A a lot more if you kill one fish than you are the genetics, the gene pool of pond B if you kill one fish. Does that make sense? Okay. Let me bring this to humanistic terms. Let's say there's a guy here at Pierce College who's really good looking. He's cool, he's nice, he's smart, he's hot. All the girls want to be with him, all the guys want to be hanging out with him. Is he well adapted for this population? Oh yeah. Is he likely to go on and have a bunch of babies and a good job and all that? Oh yeah. But let's say he steps off the curb on victory, doesn't look both ways, gets hit by a bus. He's dead. It didn't have anything to do with his genetics, did it? That he was taken out of the gene pool. It has everything to do with happenstance. It just happened. Genetic drift. The last one that we're going to concentrate on is founder effect. Founder effect occurs when a small segment of a population becomes reproductively isolated from the larger population. This causes the smaller population to diverge over time genetically from the parent population. This is a pretty easy one to understand with the right graphics. It's difficult to look at with just reading it. Founder effect is when a small group of a larger population goes off and founds a new place. They move somewhere new. Let me explain how this works. Okay, so this is a classic example of founder effect. Here we've got some ladybugs, all right? And we have, I guess those are ladybugs. I'm not sure what they're supposed to be. But we have a parent population, a large population from whence they come. These guys are both red and green, right? And let's say just one or two of these, let's say a couple, a little loving couple of red ones. Red ladybugs take off and go somewhere else. What's going to happen to that population of ladybugs? Are they going to have any green ones in there in the new population? No. So over time, as this red population gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, what's going to happen? They're all going to be red. They're never going to have as much genetic diversity as the original founding population. This can happen in a lot of different ways. It happens in humans too. We'll explain a few of them. After you read the Salt Shaker's Curse, we'll talk a little bit about this idea. But one of the things that can happen here is this directional thing here can cause, if you can imagine if there was a couple of dents on either side, something can cause a die-off amongst this original population. Let's say we grab a bunch of them, right? And we start taking them on a long journey. But only the red ones have the capability of surviving this long journey for whatever reason. So obviously, green ones can survive in their homeland. But let's say the red ones happen to be a little bit better at dealing with cold than the green ones. So we grab a few of them. Let's say I grab 3 of them. 2 reds and a green, or even 4. 2 greens and 2 reds. Stick them in a bottle and carry them up to, I don't know, the north somewhere. Say I'm going up to Alaska. On the way up, it gets cold and the green ones die. They can't survive the trip. And then when I open up the cork on the bottle and let them go, the only ones that are alive are the red ones. So what's going to happen to my Alaskan population of these red ones? 10,000 years from now, it's still going to all be red ones. Whereas if I go back down to Louisiana or wherever I got these original ladybugs, there's going to be more genetic diversity in that population because the green ones still survive down there. So that trip, that journey, is called the bottleneck effect, where some event occurs that kills off some of them. And the only ones that survive carry on those genetics to help them survive in that situation, in that new situation. So this is how sometimes genetics can be carried through over time or space or place, could be carried through and other genetics get stopped because something during that initial event kills them out. It could be that one is more susceptible to a given disease, or that one is more susceptible to, as my example showed it, heat or temperature change or something like that. We'll reinvestigate the founder's effect and all of the rest of these as we go along. But they've basically founded a new population. That's why it's called founder effect. The newly founded populations don't always represent the genetic diversity of their source population.